time in history when women's lives were narrowly defined, when a young girl's future often included only the roles of wife and mother, one young woman from Maine instead chose a life in business, journalism, and most important of all, public service. Hello, I'm Jack Perkins. Margaret Chase Smith. The very name has dignity, and so did she. She was Margaret Chase before her marriage. She was Maggie to some, though she never liked that name. She was Senator Smith to Washington, D.C. and to the world. And Senator Smith's accomplishments were remarkable. Many of the firsts that go beside her name are due to her efforts to blaze new trails for women. Because after all, don't forget, though it was not that long ago, politics in America was still, in those days, a man's work. And here was a woman trying to do the people's work. She was a woman of grace, of resolve, and of seemingly endless energy. A remarkable woman whose life began in an unremarkable way. Margaret Madeline Chase was born on December 14, 1897 in Skowhegan, Maine, the first of 6 children in the family. Margaret's mother, Carolyn Morin Murray, had married George Emery Chase in October of 1896, and the couple had come to live in the home of her grandfather, John Murray, soon after their marriage. Carolyn preferred to be called Carrie, but Margaret liked the name just as it was. Margaret always remembered her mother warmly as an indomitable and remarkably energetic woman, and that sense of independence was something that Carrie undoubtedly passed along to her daughter. It certainly showed itself in Margaret's first entry to the work world at the ripe old age of 12. Over the years, Margaret would relate the simple story of her first job numerous times, to the point that, like many of the stories connected with her life, it has evolved a bit into legend.
I wanted to earn some money, and I think I was only 12 years old when I went in and applied for a job in the 5 and 10 cent store. The man suggested that I grow a little taller so that I could reach the shelves. Later on, perhaps a year later, I went back and asked for a job again.
What Margaret first lacked in height, she apparently made up for in determination, because she landed that job on the second try. She did well in school, studying at Skowhegan High School, where her life started to come into focus.
Margaret went to high school in Skowhegan and finished high school. That was relatively rare in those years for all students, but particularly for girls.
Professor Jenan Sherman is the chairman of the Department of History at the University of Memphis and the author of one of the more respected biographies of Margaret Chase Smith.
She learned sort of a group of stenography skills while she was there, so she would be able to make a living. One of the pivotal moments, though, for her high school career was playing basketball. She loved playing basketball, and she really felt that she came into her own playing basketball. She learned some leadership skills there.
Margaret had dreams of attending Sargent's College in Boston, with plans to become a physical education teacher, but these were expensive dreams, so she kept at her work in Skowhegan, eventually ending up as a relief operator for the Maine telephone company.
In Margaret's last year in high school, as she was working at night as an operator, and in those days, of course, you spoke to the operator, she got a phone call from somebody with a wonderful voice, as she described it, and it was Clyde Smith. He was the first selectman in Skowhegan, a big businessman in town. That was the sort of first fabled meeting of the two.
Clyde Smith was known and respected in Skowhegan. He was handsome, smart, and cut a striking figure. But he was older than Margaret and divorced, and even she had heard bits of gossip about Clyde's way with the ladies, as it was said. But Clyde was well liked, and he liked Margaret. He was just beginning to make his mark, a politician of the old school whose compass was already starting to point toward the governor's mansion in Augusta.
Clyde Smith was I think a very smart man. He was a savvy politician, but he was a little bit more than that. He was very much what we call now a retail politician, face-to-face, hand-to-hand.
But Clyde wasn't a real factor in Margaret's life yet, and there was much yet to happen before he would be. Even Margaret herself said back then she never thought much about the future. But her hard work, that distinctive Maine work ethic, was leading her to that future nevertheless. Merton Henry is a prominent Portland, Maine attorney, now retired, who knew Margaret Chase Smith for most of her political career. They met when Henry was president of the Young Republicans during his years at Bowdoin College, and he subsequently came to work on Smith's political campaigns, and they became lifelong friends.
I think the fact that Senator Smith grew up in a small Maine community, in a family that was basically poor, had to work at an early age, and I think that was crucial in laying the groundwork for what became her career.
The United States was in the midst of World War I as Margaret Chase was finding her way after high school graduation. The war was ever present in small-town life and in Margaret's life, and it was taking a heavy toll on Skowhegan. Out of a town of about 5,000, Skowhegan lost 17 to the Great War, and Margaret knew many of those young men personally. There were constant reminders of the war at home, blazing newspaper headlines and cries for everyone to support the war effort in any way possible. The Skowhegan community rallied with demonstrations of patriotism and volunteer work for the Red Cross. It would leave an indelible mark on Margaret Chase, and her experience with world at war began to shape her political perspectives even as she began work as a teacher in nearby Pitt's school. Teaching didn't suit Margaret as well as she had thought, and that foray into education was brief, but she soon found a niche when she was hired by the local paper, the Independent Reporter. There, Margaret found an outlet for her clerical skills, her keen sense of organization, and her developing ambitions, and she held a series of positions with the paper over the next 8 years. Perhaps more important to her future during this time, Margaret Chase also continued to establish herself in the community, investing her seemingly limitless energies in numerous civic and women's clubs.
Women's clubs were quite the thing in those days. And this was really a pivotal kind of education for Margaret, because she becomes, first of all, she joins, but then very quickly becomes an officer. So she gets to make speeches, development policy. She was quite well known. She got involved in politics, then became a Republican committeewoman in the town of Skowhegan. Margaret Chase builds a network of women that are pivotal to her later when she becomes active in politics in her own right.
Still in her 20s, and perhaps without really knowing it, Margaret Chase was well on her way to changing the national mindset that women were suited only for certain roles. While Margaret was working on becoming Margaret Chase, Clyde Smith was always somewhere nearby. Clyde's career in politics had been progressing steadily during these years. He had served on the school board, as sheriff, as selectman in Skowhegan, 2 terms in the Maine House of Representatives, 3 in the Maine Senate.
Margaret was confused, trying to figure out what this relationship was and where it was going to go. He kept showing up, kept coming around, and they would attend meetings together and those sorts of things, but it really didn't develop, and certainly not the way she wished it had.
Though Margaret was often left wondering if she and Clyde had any future together, there were other circumstances pushing Clyde toward marriage.
Clyde Smith was eager to run for governor. He was a divorced man, and it was really important that he have a wife in order to become governor. And here in the state of Maine, right in his own hometown, was this wonderful young woman who'd been sort of waiting in the wings for him for a long time, who'd built a wonderful reputation of her own. And so in 1930 they married. And she hung on to her name because it was renowned in the state of Maine. So she became not Mrs. Smith, but Mrs. Margaret Chase Smith.
Despite the difference in their ages and the remarkably long courtship, once they were married, it was a match that seemed to make sense.
I think that when they married, it was sort of a joining of forces of common interest.
Margaret Chase Smith was now a politician's wife. Along with her other duties, she threw herself into the role with typical enthusiasm, hosting bean suppers, managing his affairs, and running a large household single-handedly. Margaret did not, however, surrender her own civic connections, and against some protest from Clyde, later in 1930 she advanced to serve as a member of the Republican State Committee. It was not an idyllic marriage, but neither was it an extremely difficult one.
Margaret talked about Clyde as a partner. When they were first married, he called her Sis, and she always called him Mr. Smith. But she called it a partnership. She called it a business arrangement rather than a great love.
In 1936, when Clyde announced his run for the State House, Margaret became integral to his work, virtually managing and orchestrating the campaign. Her razor-sharp memory and all her experience in administration paid off as she kept track of Clyde's campaign appearances, his correspondence, and virtually every other detail of the campaign. Margaret was a tremendous asset in Clyde's political ambitions, but about a year into the campaign, political wrangling within the Republican Party pushed Clyde out of the race for the governor and into a run for Maine's 2nd Congressional District.
Margaret ran the campaign. She was very good at keeping track of who his volunteers were, who the contact people were in any place that they went. She took care of his correspondence, she kept track of the money. She just did it all.
And in 1936, the newly elected Congressman Clyde Smith and his charming and supportive wife were off to Washington.
She insisted that he give her the title of his secretary, and there again she begins to build a network of women.
Many predicted a brilliant and promising future for the Smiths in Washington. No one realized it at the time, but that future belonged more to Margaret than it did to Clyde. In the 1930s, the Republican Party, and both Clyde and Margaret were lifelong Republicans, was developing into a party of different camps. In a way, Clyde and Margaret personified those differing Republican philosophies. Margaret had very much restrained her own public persona as she entered Washington as Clyde's wife, and by the time the U.S. was in the run-up to World War II, their differences of political opinion began to show.
Clyde, of course, goes to Washington during the New Deal, and though he is a Republican, he's quite a liberal. And he immediately begins working on labor legislation, which keeps him in Congress and he can't get home. And so he sends Margaret to just speak for him when she is in Maine. What's interesting that happens as the war is heating up is that Clyde Smith is talking in one direction and Margaret Smith is talking in yet another. Clyde Smith was very much in favor of neutrality. He did not think that the United States had any interest in a war in Europe. He was afraid that we would be sucked into a war we could ill afford when we had so many social problems at home. Margaret is going home. She is speaking very differently about the coming war.
One particular day when Margaret had been asked to represent Clyde in Maine has become legend. He had asked her to speak for him at a Navy Day event in October of 1938 in front of the Kennebec County Women's Republican Club. With confidence in her abilities, if perhaps too cavalier an attitude about Margaret's own developing political presence and opinions, Clyde apparently refused to help Margaret prepare the speech.
She makes a rather famous speech that she made on Navy Day and notes how vulnerable the United States was in a coming war. So she is speaking very strongly about being prepared for war, while Clyde Smith is arguing for neutrality. The Navy Day speech is actually sort of the opening shot. And it spells out her whole philosophy about the need for a very strong military. But I think it comes from a very deep place, a very heartfelt place for her.
Meanwhile, Clyde Smith's work in Washington began to take a toll on his health. Along with his continuing work on labor matters in Washington, this meant that it was Margaret who represented Clyde during his bid for re-election at the Republican convention in Maine in the spring of 1940. After strenuous days of speaking and charming delegates and constituents in Maine, Margaret began the long trek back to Washington. By the time she reached Boston, exhausted, word was waiting that Clyde had become gravely ill and she should return to Washington as soon as possible. When Margaret did arrive in Washington, she found that Clyde's condition had worsened. It had been a heart attack, and not the first he had suffered.
It's getting close to the time to file for his next term, and in fact he advises his wife to file in her own name because he thinks if he has another heart attack, or even in the condition he was in, he might not be able to campaign as vigorously as he'd like. So the idea was she would file and then step aside once he was on his feet. But he does not get on his feet.
At the close of that weekend, all during Sunday evening, at Clyde's insistence, Margaret enlisted friends and family in Maine to begin circulating nomination papers for her. And Clyde instructed her to get in touch with his Republican supporters to let them know he wished them to transfer their support to her candidacy.
As Clyde Smith lay dying, he dictated a press release to all of his constituents and said to them, "All I ask of my friends and supporters is that in the coming primary and general election, if I'm unable to enter the campaign, they support the candidate of my choice, my wife and my partner in public life, Margaret Chase Smith."
Around midnight that Sunday, seeing what lay ahead, Margaret sent the nurse out of Clyde's room and climbed into bed beside her husband. She remembered that for a time Clyde talked softly to her and told her how much he cared for her, and then he was gone. Clyde Smith died, leaving an unexpired congressional term, an election undecided, and a young widow who had many decisions to make in just a few short days. The very day Clyde was buried, Margaret was faced with the news of a special election to choose the person who would complete his unexpired term. She barely had time to think, much less the luxury of mourning her husband's death. In deference to Clyde's final requests, the Republican leadership of the state essentially conceded the primary of the special election to Margaret Chase Smith.
Contrary to popular belief, congresswomen or widows of congressmen are not appointed to fill their seats. That does happen in the Senate, but not in the Congress. And so Margaret Chase Smith ran 4 campaigns, 2 primaries and 2 regular runs for his unexpired seat and his next full term in the Congress.
I think that she just went ahead and did it, and I think then really suddenly realized she'd been elected to Congress.
And Margaret Chase Smith was on her own. Her years with Clyde had given Margaret insight into the national political machinery and had provided time for her to fine-tune her own sense of personal politics with a style that became sort of an amalgam of her own personality and what she had learned from Clyde. Though she never relied on the Republican Party stalwarts, Margaret Chase Smith had inherited Clyde's political power base, which she merged with her own network of politically active women. This was the network she carried with her into Congress. But Margaret was still very much a woman in a man's world, with a background that differed greatly from that of her new colleagues.
Well, Margaret Chase Smith goes off to Washington. She's got lots of friends there, but she feels like she's totally in over her head. All of her male colleagues are attorneys for the most part, highly educated. She's painfully aware that she just has a high school education. She finds 7 other women in Congress, not exactly a large number. They're very careful not to seek one another out, not to look as though they're forming some sort of women's cabal. So she feels kind of isolated and not sure of herself about what to do.
Margaret Chase Smith responded by hitting the ground running. From the very start, she made a point of being at work in the Congress every day of sessions. In just those waning days of the 76th Congress, as she was finishing up Clyde's unexpired term, Margaret Chase Smith served on 12 committees and subcommittees. Even though these were not the more substantial committee assignments Smith later had her eye on, they were leading in the right direction. As the general election approached, columnists debated whether Maine was ready to deliberately send a woman to Congress. With the world on the brink of war, could a woman be tough enough to make all the decisions Congress would certainly soon face?
This notion that we have of stereotypes that a woman must be soft or she won't be strong on defense, well ahead of her time, she showed the country that she could be feminine, a strong woman, and have strong convictions and be a strong proponent of national defense. So she set the mold.
William Cohen served in Washington nearly 30 years, starting in 1973 in Smith's old seat in Congress, then in the Senate, then later as Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration. In hindsight, he's able to pinpoint what Washington had yet to learn in 1940.
I think it's that woman and that man who feel comfortable with who they are, that they can say and do what is consistent with their own beliefs. That sets you apart, and I think that set her apart.
That did set her apart from the moment she entered Washington to take that seat for the Maine's 2nd Congressional District. Margaret Chase Smith began to develop a reputation for her strength and diligence, but also for her poise and quiet, resolute grace, even under pressure. That set an example in Congress and well beyond. Susan Collins was first sent to Washington from Maine in 1996 and is able to proudly proclaim that she is the 15th woman to be elected to the Senate in her own right. She is also among the first to acknowledge that Margaret Chase Smith was a powerful role model.
I had gone to Washington as part of a special program, the Senate Youth Program, and I spent nearly 2 hours talking with Senator Smith. When I think back on that, I just can't believe that she took that kind of time with a high school girl from Caribou, Maine. And I remember leaving her office and thinking that I was so proud that she was my senator.
But before the Senate, Margaret Chase Smith won that House seat on her own, and as a woman, first in 1940 and again in 1942, 1944, 1946, and always by a significant margin. Smith was solidly entrenched in Washington after just one full term, so much a fixture that her own party saw no sense in any other candidate, and the Democratic Party in the state saw no hope of winning the seat.
I think the feeling in Maine, as is indicated at all of the elections, and my majority has increased each time, I think the feeling is that they may not agree with me, but they feel that I'm honest in what I'm doing, and they like to see anyone stand up and vote their convictions.
Traditionally, women had been tracked onto congressional committees that dealt with home and family, education and children. And while Margaret Chase Smith never dismissed or diminished any of the work done by anyone on any committee, from her first day in Congress, she had her eyes set on the major committees, especially the Naval Affairs Committee.
And she ultimately does get on Naval Affairs Committee, ironically on the strength of that Navy Day speech that she made earlier, where she spoke about the importance of a strong Navy. Well, on Naval Affairs, she immediately is thrown into all the big issues of the military during the war.
Committees are where the real work of Congress is done, and that's where Margaret Chase Smith wanted to be.
She was very instrumental in helping to create child care facilities for women workers in shipyards.
The long, hard fight began when Smith took a closer look at the situation of the nurses in the armed forces. At that time, nurses were nearly all women. They did some of the most difficult work imaginable, and they did it without the benefits of the rank and pay offered to men in similar service positions. They had absolutely no security and could simply be dismissed when they were no longer needed. Being a woman who had herself worked hard for professional recognition, Smith could immediately see the unfairness of the situation. For her, the only sensible recourse was for the government to offer full status for the nurses, but that would be a big leap.
There is a lot of resistance on the part of Congress to giving women full status, and she says over and over again, you either need these women or you don't. If you need them, you have to pay them, you have to give them status, and if you don't, then send them home and let's forget about it. So she was zealous, fighting for this over and over again, and ultimately she prevails.
The status of women in the military would in fact be a cause that Margaret Chase Smith carried throughout her career in Washington. But her successes in this regard began with her efforts in the House. Olympia Snow held Smith's old seat in Congress starting in 1979 when, like Smith, she was elected to represent Maine in the Senate.
She was able to shepherd through the legislation that brought women into the service. It was the Women in the Military Integration Act, and that was a critical piece of legislation that really did showcase women in our nation's military.
Did this put Smith on the early front of the feminist movement in the U.S.? She would have said otherwise.
As we look at Margaret Smith's efforts on behalf of women in this period, I think we're tempted to call her a feminist, although she was very careful not to accept that title for herself. She saw feminists as being confrontational, as being anti-men and so forth, so she wouldn't define herself that way. But I think that she was very worried and very concerned about fairness and equity for women.
Years further along in her career, in a 1962 interview with CBS, Smith summed up her opinions on gender and capability.
I go on the theory that women are people, Paul. You know, I don't separate women from men as far as qualifications and appointments are concerned.
And you're not a feminist, are you?
No, indeed. Never have been a feminist.
Debates about national defense dominated Smith's first years in Washington, with many, including the government as a whole, wavering between a policy of isolationism and military buildup. But it was always about Maine, too. Her congressional office quickly became what some called a service agency for her constituents. If people back in Maine had problems, they knew they could go straight to Washington. Smith handled countless requests over the years, making a point to answer every letter on the day it arrived. And she kept in touch with the folks in Maine with columns in local newspapers, eventually running under the headline, Washington and You. Perhaps like no other legislator before her, Margaret Chase Smith became Maine's agent in Washington. These early years also came to define how Margaret Smith would handle and feel about being, undeniably, a woman in what was then a man's world. It was a great contradiction of her life and career in Washington that she was able to deftly celebrate being a woman while at the same time denying that gender should have any bearing what a person was capable of doing. But viewed in contemporary terms, perhaps this is really no contradiction at all, and in terms of gender politics, Smith was certainly ahead of her time.
Margaret Chase Smith taught me that every issue is a woman's issue, whether it's taxes or education or child care or homeland security. Women are just as affected as men are.
I think once she set the standard to say that yes, the Maine people will elect someone that they have confidence in, and it won't matter whether it's male or female. They just want you to be true to your own convictions and true to the values and the virtues of the people of Maine.
But walking the gender line in her own life kept Margaret Chase Smith keenly aware of the difficulties faced by women everywhere, especially those in the armed services. She believed that service women deserved to be treated with nothing less than the respect they deserved, and in 1945 Smith introduced comprehensive legislation that would offer these women equality and permanence. She fought aggressively in the matter, and finally on July 12, 1948, President Truman signed into law the Women's Armed Services Integration Act. Because government is largely a collective process, it's not often that one person can be credited for the passage of a bill when it finally makes its way to the president's desk. This is one notable exception. Margaret Chase Smith had played hardball for something she believed in, and she had won. While Smith was building a reputation for being tough on military issues and an advocate for women, she was also building a relationship with a man who would come to shape the rest of her career in Washington.
It was during those early years, those war years on the Naval Affairs Committee, that Margaret Smith meets the most important man in her life. Navy Lieutenant J.G. Bill Lewis was the counsel on the Naval Affairs Committee. He was the attorney for the committee and traveled with the committee always. Because Margaret was so careful about maintaining her position vis-a-vis seniority, she always sat down at the far end of the table, the last seat on the table, and she was right next to Bill Lewis.
An unusual Washington partnership was born for Smith and Lewis, she in the forefront, he in the background during Smith's time on the Naval Affairs Committee.
And in what became, I think, a perfect metaphor for their later relationship, Bill Lewis wrote a question down on a piece of paper and slid it over in front of her on the table. And she was a little reluctant to ask the question, afraid there'd be a follow-up question, but more reluctant not to use it because then he wouldn't give her any more questions. And so she asked that question, and that is how the relationship developed. So right from the beginning, Margaret Smith came to rely heavily on Bill Lewis. He was always there for her. He had the education she didn't have. He was an attorney and he had an MBA from Harvard, and he gave her a lot of confidence because he provided her with not just the questions but also the research behind the things that she needed to do.
With thousands of hours of committee work behind her, overwhelmingly positive election margins, and 8 successful years in the House, it was time for Margaret Chase Smith to take the next step to the Senate.
Senator White, who was my predecessor, had been thinking about retiring, and I had had a very interesting career there in the House. I was the senior member of the House delegation of 3 from Maine, and I thought that at least I should try or should give it consideration. But it just happened. I think there was no great planning for it.
It'd be a huge leap with many risks. No woman had ever successfully run for Senate on her own. Smith knew she would have to forfeit her seat in the House. Her campaign would be a landmark, but it would be a campaign she ran her way, with honesty and integrity, and without money politics or smear tactics. Mounting the campaign would require tapping into the network of people Smith had come to know over the years, people she had helped, and those who knew her reputation for hard work and integrity in Congress.
She could rely on those people to do the volunteer work necessary to run campaigns the way they were run in that period of time before television became the dominant factor in political campaigns.
The campaign marked one further step in the evolution of Smith's political style, cementing her resolve to refuse campaign contributions. That choice was hers, but for this campaign, it was a calculated one. Her opponents were no lightweights. Smith was facing 3 men, each with significant resources behind him. A well-respected clergyman, the Reverend Albion Beveridge, Maine's previous governor, Sumner Sewell, and the state's sitting governor, Horace Hildreth.
They tried to raise some money. They couldn't raise nearly enough to make any difference, and ultimately she decided to take the moral high ground and just simply refused to take campaign contributions at all.
Supporters contributed postage and green stamps, their time and their voices, and Smith was pioneering in her efforts to send mail directly to groups of constituents based on issues, interests, and targeting men and women separately. It was a style of campaigning not often seen in national politics, boldly crossing party lines, running without a political machine, building a network from person to person across the state. And it was a style that influenced most of the Maine politicians who came after. The campaign meant 18-hour days for Smith and her team and countless weekend train and car trips between Washington and Maine.
This was going to be a tough fight. She was going to be running against 2 governors, one ex-governor, one sitting governor, 2 millionaires, one of whom had the Maine Republican machine behind him. But she decided that this was the time for her to do this, and with the help of Bill Lewis, they made a very strong push for this race.
Angus King served Maine for many years, first to work in broadcasting and business, then in the state house as governor from 1995 to 2003. He knew Smith well during those years.
She was tough, and she didn't have any
I was about to say she didn't care what people thought. Of course she cared, but she had such a strong sense of herself that she was going to do what she thought was right.
Smith's 1948 campaign was also a landmark for Skowhegan. Since 1940, the small Maine town already had its woman in the House, of course, but it had never before had a homegrown senator. The national newsreels followed Smith's run for the Senate, while throughout the country the questions returned, what business does a woman have in the United States Senate?
They said that there's no place for a woman, the old story. And of course I never was a woman candidate. I never was a woman in the House or the Senate. I was always proud that I was a woman, could do what I did, but I never did it as a woman.
But her candidacy did energize women voters in Maine in a way no campaign before had ever done. This wasn't lost on Smith, and in this campaign and others, she frequently noted the similarities between managing a home and managing the government. She saw them as similar tasks, to which a woman was particularly well suited. Smith answered numerous challenges during the campaign, among them assaults on her voting record, distortions of her ideology. She took on each accusation point by point, tearing away the deliberate misinformation so the voters could see the truth of her years in Washington. In the end, Margaret Chase Smith was sent to Washington as Maine's new senator, riding on the wave of a stunning victory. She had amassed more votes than her three opponents combined, winning by a wide margin. In later years, Smith would come to see this as just part of her career, an unfolding destiny. But at the time, she was aware of the landmark she had just laid down and was pleased to have been the one to do it, calling it a victory for all women. With the start of the 81st Congress, it was back to work for Margaret Chase Smith, now Senator for Maine and Senator at large for all of America's women.
Margaret Chase Smith rapidly gained a reputation for paying attention, for being meticulous, for being careful, for doing her homework. All of those things were the things that Bill Lewis also helped her with. And nobody put one over on Margaret Chase Smith because she was not going to be fooled. She was very, very careful about what she did and who she listened to.
From day one, Smith was on display in Washington with nearly every appearance and activity getting relentless attention. But she still had to carve her own path.
She was never an insider in the Senate. I think because she was a woman, but also because she was somewhat of a maverick. For example, she was famous for never telling anybody how she was going to vote. And I'm sure it drove the leadership crazy because they didn't know whether they could count on her vote.
The experienced, capable, and attractive woman quickly came to be a symbol for all successful professional women as well as for the Republican Party.
She could never forget that she was sharing this body with 95, later 99 men. And probably what spoke to it the strongest was the fact that she did not have access to her own restroom. The men's lounge was right off of the Senate floor. But if she needed to use the facilities, she had to go down 2 floors to where the lady tourists stood in line to use the public restroom or to try to take a long subway ride back to her Senate office. It wasn't for 12 years, not until 1959, that she gets a second office, what they called a hideaway, closer to the Senate floor so that she would have a bathroom without having to stand in line with the tourists.
Although Smith was given to dismissing this inequity as simply something that the press had found easy to talk about, it was a reminder that she was in uncharted territory, as a rose among thorns, so to speak. And it was during this time that the freshman senator did one simple thing that unwittingly added to the Smith legend and legacy.
A friend of mine gave me a lapel pin in the form of a little vase that held water. And I don't wear many ornaments. And I put water in it one day and happened to have some roses and put a rose in it. It looked pretty good. And it sort of brightened up a dark suit. And the men, of course, were all dressed in dark usually. And it got to be such a part of me that if I did not have a rose on when I went to the floor in the morning, some of the senators would come over and ask if I had forgotten to dress. And so it became quite a part of me and my daily habits.
That flower in her lapel, usually but not always a rose, came to be part of Smith's image in Washington and in the world. In the style of the day and without pretense, it was a graceful way to show who she was and what she was. There was only one day in which the brightness of the little bloom worried Senator Smith. One day many years into her career in Washington, in 1963, the day after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. When the Senate resumed its session that day, Smith had worried about that ever-present flower, whether it would be unsuitable. But at the request of other senators, she wore the rose, and at the start of the session, she removed the flower from her lapel and placed it on John Kennedy's old desk in the Senate. Starting in 1948, Senator Smith became an active and reliable committee member. She completed hundreds of committee assignments in her career, many of them relating to the armed services. But it was a learning process.
You realize that a new member, a young person or any person going in to the House or the Senate knows nothing about it. It's entirely different than anything they've ever done. They don't know the committee makeup, they don't know the importance of the committee. Most of the work is done in the committee. And they go in and immediately think they should be chairman of a committee. Well, you're not equipped to be chairman of a committee. And sometimes you're not equipped if you're there 100 years.
Like never before, for Senator Smith, her work in Washington was her life. But the work never changed her character or the way she had of serving the people of Maine.
I have placed my official duty ahead of personal advantage. I have placed my Senate duties ahead of campaigning. This has meant staying on the job in Washington rather than in Maine campaigning. But it has been my pleasure to see many of you at least once a year. For every year I have set aside 1 month to 6 weeks to traveling throughout the state in every one of the 16 counties, at a time after the Senate has adjourned for the year. I don't believe that any other of your public officials can match that record.
Senator Margaret Chase Smith eventually would serve in the Senate more than 24 years, but events that would shape her legacy began to unfold in just her first. The late 1940s were times of extreme change in the U.S. and abroad. The British and French empires had begun to splinter into new nations, and the Cold War had begun. With all the change came a mounting American fear of communism, what it meant, and what its impact might be with the atomic bomb as part of the equation. A number of years earlier, the House Committee on Un-American Activities had been formed. There, the country heard for the first time the question, "Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party of the United States?" The committee came to be called HUAC, and though Senator Smith was well aware of the committee while she was in the House, she could not have known at the start of her Senate career just how much the issues facing HUAC would expand and come to define part of her own time in Washington. Margaret Chase Smith watched as the temperatures in Washington swung from abject fear to a posture of military assertiveness, from caution to smear, and she could not watch in silence. She would eventually become the one, the only one, and the first to step forward and speak in an effort to calm the nerves and raise the consciousness of a nation. She began her term in the Senate with a call for the Republican Party to humanize itself in the eyes of American voters. She believed that Congress needed to be direct and honest with the people of America, but her independent voice was not always welcomed by party leadership, and hers was not the only voice surfacing in this new crop of senators. There was also Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin.
Fairly early on in the Senate, Margaret Smith learned to distrust Senator McCarthy, Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin. She found him to be duplicitous, that he would say one thing and do another, so she was distrustful of him anyway. But after he made his speech to the Wheeling, West Virginia Women's Republican Club about 205 communists in the State Department and Truman not doing anything about them, she began to wonder about what he was up to. Although she certainly was in favor of going after communists, She was very concerned about the tactics he was using, and really starting to be concerned about the fact that everybody in Congress was running scared.
True acts of courage are not those we premeditate, and it was never Smith's intention to simply be courageous. True to her form and to her conscience, Smith was merely reacting to what was evolving around her, speaking up and staying true to her own moral compass.
I got very worried, Paul. You may remember what days those were back there in 49, 48, 49, and 50. There was so much suspicion among people. There was so much fear. They were getting to the point where people hardly dared to speak their thoughts or their minds for fear of being accused of being communists, trial by accusation. Oh, there were so many things that were going on that I got very, very much concerned. I never did name him by name because it was the whole operation that bothered me so much. And I thought someone should speak up. I thought that we were getting to the place where we were almost indifferent to what was going on, out of the fear that we had of what was going on.
Smith tried more than once to get to the bottom of the accusations and the fear.
I asked him one day on when I was in the Senate. He sat 2-3 seats back of me, and I remember clearly I went, turned around, put my hand out. Let me see one of those, Joe. And he said he didn't pay attention to me. And I said again, Joe, let me see one of those, just one. And he said, don't you believe me? And I said, well, I'd feel better if I could see a signature myself. But I never saw one, and I think perhaps no one did see them.
Margaret Chase Smith was always one to think before she spoke, and as senator, she relied on her sharp mind and the equally sharp mind and hard work of Bill Lewis. In the maelstrom of what would later be dubbed McCarthyism, she took the same tack. She was deeply concerned that McCarthy was taking legitimate issues and distorting them.
She and Bill Lewis used to drive back and forth from Washington to Maine, and they decided it was Memorial Day weekend, and they decided to come to Maine for Memorial Day weekend, and she sat at the kitchen table with Bill Lewis in Skowhegan and wrote the speech. And it was about America and Americanism and how what McCarthy was doing wasn't really consistent with American values.
And during the entire time, instead of talking about my Memorial Day speeches, I was talking about the McCarthy problem. And we talked a good deal about some of the points that ought to be raised. And the next day, here at my house, we sat and outlined the statement. He pretty much drew up an outline of it, and I got in my thoughts along the way, and then we went over it together very, very carefully, and because we wanted to get everything in but keep it very, very brief.
We were right here in this room behind me with Aunt Margaret and her executive assistant Bill Lewis and my mom and dad and myself sitting here as they were practicing and refining the speech and trying this and trying that. And of course at 12 years old I really got kind of bored with it, and Aunt Margaret was very good at recognizing that and stopped the whole process for probably a half hour and made an attempt to explain to me what it was all about.
It was a speech that would come to define her professional style. But as with all defining moments, the beginnings were small and sometimes difficult to recognize while they were happening.
There's the little train that runs between the Capitol, the Senate office building and the Capitol underground. She had the speech, she got on the little train. Who's sitting in the car? Joe McCarthy. And he says, "How are you, Margaret?" And she said, "I'm all right, Joe, but I'm going over to make a speech, and when I finish, you're not going to like it." He said, "Oh, Margaret, I'm sure it'll be fine," or something like that. But there's this wonderful moment of, can you imagine, here's this woman, she'd been in the Senate for 2 years, and here she is confronting this guy by accident on the way to deliver the speech. She had copies, they had copies of the speech for the press, and Bill Lewis was up in the press gallery with the speeches in his hand. But his instructions were, don't hand out any copies of the speech till you see me stand up and read the first paragraph, because she was afraid till the moment she was on the floor that she'd lose her nerve. Again, it was a tremendously courageous act. You know, you were taking your political life in your hands at that time, in any way challenging McCarthy.
On June 1st, during the regular Senate session, Margaret Chase Smith stood and spoke her mind. Without flourish or personal indictment, she quietly awakened the sleeping conscience of the nation. The primary object of her words, Joseph McCarthy, was unnamed by Smith but known to all, and he sat just 2 rows behind her in the Senate chambers.
He sat several 2-3 seats back of me, and he sat there with his face in his hands, and just I couldn't see him, but they said he didn't move or blink an eye. He just sat and listened.
Senator Margaret Chase Smith's Declaration of Conscience speech was certainly a seminal moment in our nation's history. And she, I think, spoke to the fears, you know, that most Americans felt at that point in time. And she did what 94 of her male colleagues, I might add, dared not to do, with 15 minutes in her Declaration of Conscience speech. And as a result, defeated a giant of demagoguery with Senator Joe McCarthy. It really was a remarkable moment. As Bernard Baruch once said, had a man made that speech, he would become the next president of the United States.
Perhaps the adage is right, at least in this case. It takes a woman. But if the Senate's only woman wasn't already a lightning rod for controversy and contention, she surely was now.
She managed to get a half dozen of her colleagues to sign on to her Declaration of Conscience before she gave it, but within a couple of weeks, they had all but one of them discredited it and told McCarthy, well, they didn't mean it. He was extraordinarily powerful, and he could punish people, and he did. And he punished her as well. She was thrown off of several committees. She was ostracized ultimately by her own party as the wrong kind of Republican. Joseph McCarthy never found a communist. None.
I think it was the beginning of the decline of Joe McCarthy, because she exposed him for the fraud that he was.
Smith continued to work hard at everything before her in the Senate and in preparing for another election, but she took a beating for having spoken her mind, and so very publicly.
It was in 1954, in the Republican primary, that the opposition was saying that I was dying of cancer. And of course I was doing the work down here and traveling to Maine weekends, and I was working very, very hard, but I have missed, I think the records will show that I have missed only one vote in my 22 years of service on anything that could be called illness.
I think there is no doubt that Senator Smith's Declaration of Conscience speech set back her Senate career. And it was not until well into the 60s, when the McCarthy era was behind, the early 60s, that she was allowed to really assume the role on committees and things that she really was entitled to by her seniority.
Even though there were now stirrings of opposition to what McCarthy was doing, he still had power, and he had no intention of letting Smith go unpunished for her actions. One way he could strike at her was during the coming election.
1954, McCarthy sends his own man, Jones, into Maine to run against Margaret Smith, and it was a really ugly campaign, financed by outside forces and all the rest of it. Again, another effort to punish her for her strong stand against McCarthy.
On the ballot, the election pitted Robert L. Jones against Smith for her new Senate seat, but it also pitted the struggle between the ideals symbolized by Smith on one side against McCarthy's ideas on the other. The struggle manifested itself in that election and became the focus of national politics.
On June 21st, the Republicans of the state of Maine will decide whether it will be Mr. Jones or Mrs. Smith. And Mrs. Smith will learn the price or the reward of conscience.
She paid a big price for speaking out against her party, speaking out against McCarthy. We celebrate her now as this amazing, courageous act, but she was, I think, harmed. Her entire career was harmed. As you know, it took the Senate another 4 years to get around to censuring him. They don't censure him until 1954. And Margaret Smith is profoundly disappointed by the leadership in her own party who will not stop him, will not criticize him, especially President Eisenhower.
Yet after the campaign that saw some of the worst mudslinging ever witnessed in Maine politics, Margaret Chase Smith defeated Jones in the primary by a 5-1 margin. But politics in Maine was changing by 1954, and voters were no longer sending Republicans to Washington out of pure habit. Smith faced Democrat Paul Fulham in the general election, and it was a legitimate tussle until near the end of the campaign when Smith made a televised speech on the night before the election in which she kept to the high ground but pointedly rebutted each of Fulham's negative characterizations of her and her record. Smith defeated Fulham with fully 59% of the vote, but the Democrats were beginning to regain power in Maine, and voters had put Edmund Muskie, a Democrat, in the State House. Because Smith's win was weaker this time than it had been in previous years, the Democrats saw it as reason for hope. The election of 1954 was many things, but it was by no means the sundown of Margaret Chase Smith's time in the Senate.
So Margaret Smith defeats Jones, McCarthy's chosen candidate in 1954, back to the Senate for another 6 years. And again, the talk starts about the possibilities that she might be a vice presidential possibility. And so when Eisenhower decides that he wants to spend a couple of days fishing in Maine, and decides also to stop in and visit the senator in Skowhegan, this really fuels the talk about whether she's going to be asked to be his vice president. He comes to Skowhegan. It's a grand celebration. This is a very big deal. He goes out to the fairgrounds and makes a big speech. He comes back for a lobster bake in her backyard right on the banks of the Kennebec. Most likely, however, he just wanted to both spend a couple of days fishing in Maine, which he loved to do, and also pay his respects to who has now become a senior senator and a very important person in the Republican Party.
In what might seem like a strange stroke of media attention, during the 1956 campaign, Smith was called upon to debate a former First Lady, the estimable Eleanor Roosevelt.
It was a big event, and it was unique because normally you did not see women out in front in American politics at that point in time. And I think everyone was impressed that Senator Smith held her own very nicely. I think that she felt that it probably was one of those things that she had to do is if she was to be a major player on the national political scene.
Smith considered all the talk and the jockeying to be complimentary, and she even did her part to push along the speculation. But an Eisenhower-Smith ticket for the White House was not to be. Knowing and learning were always important to Margaret Chase Smith. She read the bills before deciding how to vote, thought before she spoke, wanted to understand things before she developed opinions, and she liked to have her information firsthand.
Well, after the whole McCarthy mess was over with and the Senate finally gets around to censoring him in 1954, Smith is actually right in the middle of an around-the-world tour that she takes totally on her own and totally financed by herself and by Bill Lewis to see what was going on in the world. And she decides to set off on her own to talk to the major heads of state around the world. Everybody you could think of who was important in the world in those days, she interviewed them and tried to find out what the situation was, what is really going on with communism in the world, so that she could make better decisions when she came home to the Senate.
In a changing and ever more connected world, it was a natural step for Smith to seek out international leaders in her quest to better understand and do her job in the Senate. But the trip itself was unprecedented, and the media took notice. Cameras from CBS News followed Smith for most of the trip, and her interviews with world leaders became a regular feature of the popular See It Now program hosted by Edward R. Murrow.
Oh, it clearly elevated her her visibility on the national scene, because the broadcasting of those programs, I think, were widely heralded, and the quality of her interviews was really picked up, and people were very impressed by her access to all of these leaders.
Though the trips were personal and entirely unofficial, the national press praised America's senator abroad. Smith was already recognizable as the only woman in the U.S. Senate. Now she was in homes across the country, a regular feature, bringing an educated, broad-minded international perspective to Americans, the likes of which they had never before seen in living rooms. Smith brought that perspective with her back to Washington and quickly gained a reputation for her firm stance against the nationalism in the USSR that seemed then to be tangled up with issues of communism. But the political climate in Maine and Washington was changing in other ways.
By this time, in the late 1950s, the party system in Maine was changing rather drastically. It had always been a one-party state. It had always been the Republican Party. But there was an ascendant Democratic Party by this time, and Margaret was sharing her Senate life with titular head, I guess, of the Democratic Party in Maine, Senator Muskie. They did not get along well. There was lots of jostling for position between the two of them. And come 1960, Senator Muskie decides that maybe somebody needs to take on Margaret Chase Smith and defeat her. And he comes up with what he thinks is the perfect candidate, another woman, Lucia Cormier. It takes a woman to defeat a woman, or at least that was the assumption of the Democratic Party. First time two women had contended for a Senate seat. And there was a lot of effort to sort of stir up animosity between the two. But it turns out that their positions on policy weren't all that much different, and both of them were absolutely committed to not getting involved in catfights and giving the press what they wanted. And so it turned out into rather a tepid campaign, and Margaret Smith won easily.
Though they were often pitted against each other, Muskie held Smith in the same high esteem as did the others in the Senate. In particular, he saw and respected how much her work meant to Maine.
And so I always found her interested in working with me, notwithstanding our party differences.
By now it was the 1960s, fully 20 years into her career in Washington, and still another landmark challenge lay ahead for Margaret Chase Smith.
1964, Margaret Chase Smith, senator, stateswoman, decides to toss her bonnet in the ring and run for president. This was a very strange campaign because she decided, first of all, she was not going to accept any campaign contributions, and she was not going to absent herself from the Senate. That was a little bit difficult to do, but she did jump into the New Hampshire primary, figured that she would do very well, and thought because they were her kind of people that she would come out pretty well.
I shall not alter my plans on the money because it would be so out of character for me. My Maine campaigns, my campaigns in the state of Maine, and as you know, I have increased my majorities each time. I have not spent money. I think the largest amount that I ever spent was in 1948 in my first election for the Senate, and both the primary and the election cost me less than $10,000. The offers of money have been very, very fine, and I'm deeply grateful. But I want to go into the primary in New Hampshire in character.
Well, she didn't come out as well as she had hoped. So she moved on to Illinois. The main reason she decided to enter the Illinois primary, well, first of all, it didn't cost anything. There wasn't any filing fee. And she had a cadre of people, actually two groups in Illinois who were interested in her candidacy. One was a group of club women who wanted to see her run for president. The other was some Illinois state legislators who wanted to see her be vice president.
She was running on her record with as much conviction as any of the candidates, and again concurrently celebrating the fact that she was a woman and denying that her gender should make any difference in the matter.
I've had 23 years in the House and the Congress. I have had a run of record roll call votes, missing only an occasional one, never one by illness, never missing one since 1955, June 1, 1955. I think my record of service and accomplishment and of years is greater than any of the other announced candidates and most of the talked of unannounced candidates. I think I have a good record. I'm very proud of my record. I can see no reason why, as a woman, I should not put that record to good use as well as any man could.
It was extraordinarily difficult for her to maintain, and a lot of it had to do with who she was and with her gender. She was out making speeches about policy. She was a war hawk, very strong on military defense, very strong anti-communist, but at the same time, in order to sort of set her feminine credentials, she was passing out recipes for blueberry muffins. She was caught, as most political women are caught, in an untenable situation, to look strong and powerful as a man would, as a leader would, and still be an authentic feminine woman.
And it was a campaign in classic Smith style. No financial contributions, no beholding to anyone for the money behind her bid for the White House, and no reliance on television or radio ads, despite the fact that the media were now playing increasingly important roles in political campaigns.
There was no money to do bumper stickers, to set up any kind of phone banks, any of the rest of it. It was all done on volunteers. And then because she wouldn't leave the Senate if there was a vote, she only made it to Illinois for a couple of weekends. She did surprisingly well there, though, and got about 26% of the vote. And I think at that point she thought she had a pretty good shot of being named Goldwater's vice president. I don't think he ever considered it, but she was certainly interested in it. But it was a half-hearted campaign.
And perhaps one for which the country as a whole was not ready. A woman in the White House? A woman as president? Not in 1964.
So it was a very difficult campaign and a kind of a sideshow, actually, to the 1964 campaign season. Although she did show up at the Cow Palace out in San Francisco, she did stand in a box and heard her name being placed in nomination for a major political party for the presidency of the United States. And she ended up taking home 27 of the delegate votes when she left the Cow Palace. So she was happy. She had placed her name in a position in history as the first woman to seek the nomination of a major political party. And I think she blazed the trail and made it a little more possible for other women to follow.
As the 1960s rolled into the 70s, the changes in the world were lost on no one. America was entrenched in an increasingly problematic war in Vietnam. Richard Nixon, a former cohort of Joe McCarthy, was in the White House.
Senator Smith, I think, felt concerned when we began getting involved in Vietnam. Once we were there, she felt she had to support and back up the fact that we had troops there. But publicly, she never did anything that would undermine the armed forces that were over there.
Though always smart, always dedicated, after so many years in Washington and now in her 70s, Smith was slowly becoming a politician of another generation. To some, the disconnect and her years were beginning to show.
Margaret Smith was not sure that she really wanted to run for re-election in 1972. She was getting old, for one thing. She was 74. She just had a couple of hip replacements, so she was concerned about her health. Her eyesight was getting bad, but she also was the quintessential politician, and she was not about to give up. And when a candidate named Robert Monk said that he had $1 million to defeat her, that's all it took. She was going to run, and she was going to defeat him. It was a very difficult campaign. Part of the problem that Margaret was having was that the state of Maine was in a very different position vis-a-vis the Vietnam War than she was. She's on the Armed Services Committee, she's setting policy in Vietnam, and Maine is turning much more toward an anti-war position. So that was a big factor in this campaign.
The senator told me a story about that election that I don't know whether it was her revising history or whether it was really the way she felt, but she told me that she had no intention of running again for the Senate in 1972. The only reason she ran was that Bob Monks ran against her in the primary, and it irritated her. She thought it was an insult that he was running against her in a Republican primary, so she decided to run. But she said, once I took care of him, I didn't care.
Right in the middle of it, Bill Lewis has a heart attack, and she almost gives up hope right in the middle of the campaign. He gets back on his feet, he says, we're going to do this. In the primary, Margaret Smith soundly defeats Robert Monks and thinks that she probably is safe now. Certainly her volunteers thought she was safe. The Democratic Party is much stronger, and they put up a candidate to take her on in the regular election. Again, Margaret felt safe at this point, and so did her supporters. And all of her volunteers kind of relaxed, I think, and didn't see Hathaway as a serious challenge. But it turns out that he was, and he defeats her, and he defeats her broadly, even in her own hometown, and that profoundly hurt when Skowhegan did not even support her in that last election.
It was perhaps inevitable. Smith was 75 years old by this time. Her political base was out of the same generation, and the political world was somehow a lot younger. As with any election, there were many factors in the outcome.
I think that she was getting along in age. Her eyesight was not great at that time. We had Bill Hathaway, who was a very popular congressman. I think the combination of his running and the image that he presented certainly did a good deal to perhaps weaken her, otherwise her position. And the fact that she didn't spend any money. One of the things that she took great pride in, that she was, I think, spend enough money to send letters out and pay for the postage. Those days were changing, and as a matter of fact, they were rapidly becoming gone. And so it was almost as if she were from a different era at the time when television was now moving into politics in a major way, and the costs of that were enormous. And I think it was a miscalculation, but it was a miscalculation in combination, again, with age factor, physical restrictions perhaps, and then the state, like other parts of the country, saying time for a change.
For Margaret Chase Smith, for Washington, and for Maine, her loss in 1972 was the end of an era.
The defeat was really painful for Margaret Smith, and she didn't go home for a few years. She traveled a little bit, lived in different places, did a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship with Bill Lewis, so that she didn't have to confront going home, but she knew she always would, because Skowhegan was always her home.
The end of an era is not the end of a professional life. Smith was wounded by her loss, but her views on politics and history were sought by educators and institutions around the world, and she knew there was still much work to be done. She responded by working under the auspices of the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation at Princeton.
She thoroughly enjoyed her work with the Woodrow Wilson people and speaking on college campuses around the country. I think that she felt a great deal of responsibility for getting her papers in order so that they could be used for research and so forth. She was conscious that she had a unique place in history.
She finally goes back to Skowhegan in the mid to late 70s. Bill Lewis is very eager to see that her papers are preserved. And so Bill Lewis decides that they need to have a library that she controls, that is right there near her home, and makes an arrangement with a college called Northwood University to build the library and to make sure that her papers are available to scholars in perpetuity. Bill Lewis unfortunately dies just a couple of months before the library opens. But it was, I think, his last great act of love for her. She never had a private life. She sacrificed a private life to a political life. And she was going to need a public life to sustain her, and that's what the library provided her.
I once asked her, I said, how come you and Mr. Lewis, you and General Lewis never got married? She said, because he never asked me. But they were very close. They lived in the same house, and he was really her, by far her closest advisor. He was a very smart guy.
If the library was on a personal level Bill Lewis's gift to Margaret Chase Smith, it was the perfect one, and one that showed just how well he knew her after almost 30 years together.
People from all over the country would make their trek up to Skowhegan to pay respects to her as a stateswoman and as a great American. And it kept her vibrant, it kept her needed, it kept her important.
When the Margaret Chase Smith Library opened in 1982, the event brought dignitaries from across the country to Skowhegan to honor Senator Smith, her work, and her contribution to history and education as represented now in the library.
Following her retirement from the Senate, her collected papers and memorabilia represented an invaluable and unavailable resource for those who would learn from her 40 years of public service. Together, we determined to change that situation by constructing and operating the Margaret Chase Smith Library Center in Skowhegan at the site of Senator Smith's home. As a result, our College of Management and Entrepreneurship, with campuses in Michigan, Texas, Florida, added a fourth and unique leg here in Maine. The result has been, and I do not overuse the word, phenomenal. The Library Center as a window to the world and a continuing and contributing part of our college.
But the library was then and is now much more than just a memorial to Smith and a repository for her papers. And since its inception, the Margaret Chase Smith Library has welcomed visitors, students, scholars from all over the world, young minds and old, who wish to take advantage of the offerings at the dynamic and comprehensive Center for Research and Study. Senator Smith was a presence at the library herself for many of those years.
Senator Smith was never one to stand on pretense. She sat after the library was built in the atrium of the library off the front door of her house every morning, doing her mail and her dictation and reading the newspapers, and anybody who went by was more than welcome to stop in and visit with her. She encouraged school groups to come to the library, and they came in multitudes, and she visited with every school group that came to the library herself.
After Senator Smith's retirement, her home and the library also became a center to celebrate her life and to showcase her achievements and her awards. She has been honored with tributes both official and heartwarming. Senator Smith spent 32 years in Washington, a life in public service. She garnered 95 honorary doctoral degrees, countless awards for her work. But the most important, she earned respect and admiration all the way from Skowhegan, Maine to the far corners of the world.
I think she knew she was a historic figure. She was very good at acting like it wasn't a big deal, but it was. People who are in high positions, they want you to think that they don't care. That's nonsense. She liked being the senator. She liked the attention. It's nice to say this was just an ordinary girl from Maine that went down to the Senate and everything, but she was a senator. Senators take on certain larger-than-life qualities, and she was one of them.
Many politicians, both men and women, have followed in Smith's footsteps. Especially those from Maine have found that Margaret Chase Smith's devotion to public service not only broke ground but raised expectations for any public servant coming from the state. Somehow more is expected of Maine in the halls of government. They are expected to stand out. Oh, she is a tough act to follow.
I recall the first time that I heard her speak at the Maine Republican State Convention back in the early 1970s, and I always remember one phrase in the speech that certainly captured the essence of Margaret Chase Smith. She says, "I tell it like it is." And of course, the convention just erupted in applause.
I think what Senator Smith most taught me was to stand tall for what I believed in, no matter how difficult it might be, no matter whether it was popular, no matter whether my party agreed or not, but to stand tall for my principles. And that's what she was known for. She was a woman of such integrity.
For Margaret Chase Smith, a life well lived came to a close on Memorial Day in 1995 when she died at her home in Skowhegan. She had seen an entire century pass, had been a vital part of most of it. Her political career was her life, and she had lived it with determination, intelligence, dedication, and unsurpassed grace.
Margaret Chase Smith was who she was and also what she did. She was a trailblazer for women. She was an icon of all that was wonderful about Maine. She was frugal, she had great conscience, she had terrific integrity. She knew what was right, she knew what was wrong, and she was willing to take the risks to live up to what she thought was right or wrong. And that's what I think makes her a great American and a great stateswoman. And I don't think we'll see the likes of her anytime soon.
In 2005, Smith was honored once more. As a result of considerable joint effort by legislators from all over the country, Smith's portrait now graces the halls of the Senate chamber. And in 2007, the United States Postal Service issued a stamp bearing her likeness as part of their Distinguished Americans series. Margaret Chase Smith, first woman elected to the United States Senate in her own right, first woman elected to both houses of Congress, first woman to be nominated for President of the United States by a major political party. These firsts and accomplishments, among many others. Margaret Chase Smith was an inquisitive thinker, a careful and thoughtful speaker, a dedicated and tireless public servant. She was a daughter, a wife, a sister, an aunt, a mentor, a friend, an icon. There was another woman in somewhat more recent international political history, another Margaret, the former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. She never really knew Margaret Chase Smith. They were separated, after all, by an ocean and a generation. But she might very well have been talking about Margaret Chase Smith when she said, "Being powerful is like being a lady. If you have to tell people you are, you aren't." Well, Margaret Chase Smith never had to tell people she was powerful. Margaret Chase Smith never had to tell people she was a lady.